No priest dares to denounce God's existence during the holiest moment of Mass, but in the ancient Cathedral of Sacred Whispers, the unthinkable happened. As Father Alaric Kai Merovec raised the sacred host, his trembling hands betrayed a truth that would shake the foundations of faith itself. What followed at the altar that night would bring not just him, but every witness to their knees. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale of faith, doubt, and divine intervention, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Each week we bring you powerful stories that challenge your perspective and touch your soul. Hit that bell icon to ensure you never miss our latest uploads. Now, let's begin this remarkable journey. The Cathedral of Sacred Whispers stood like an ancient sentinel against the turbulent sky of Mistfall Grove, its gothic spires piercing through the dense fog that perpetually shrouded this coastal town. The medieval structure had weathered countless storms, but none quite like the tempest brewing within its walls on this fateful evening. Father Alaric Kai Merovec stood before the ornate mirror in the sacristy, his weathered fingers struggling with the familiar buttons of his chasuble. 23 years of priesthood had made these preparations second nature, but tonight, each movement felt foreign, as if his own body was rebelling against the ritual. The evening Mass would begin in mere minutes. Through the leaded glass windows, he could see the faithful filing into the cathedral, their shadows dancing against centuries-old stone walls. Among them was Deacon Theron Blackthorn, whose unwavering devotion had always been both an inspiration and, lately, a source of deep discomfort for Alaric. "The readings are prepared, Father." Brother Sylvan's young voice startled him from his contemplation. The novice's eager eyes reminded Alaric of his own early days, when faith flowed through his veins like liquid gold, pure and unquestioned. "Thank you, Sylvan," Alaric managed, his voice steadier than his heart. The young man lingered a moment too long, perhaps sensing the unusual tension in his mentor's demeanor. As Brother Sylvan retreated, Father Alaric turned to the ancient crucifix that had hung in the sacristy for generations. The carved face of Christ seemed different tonight, less the comforting presence it had always been, more an accusation. The questions that had been gnawing at his soul for months now rose like bile in his throat. Where were you when the children's hospital burned last month? When Sister Vesper's cancer returned? When the fishing boat carrying 12 of our parishioners vanished in the storm? The cathedral bells began their somber toll, each ring reverberating through the empty chambers of his faith. Outside, thunder growled in response, as if heaven itself was challenging his doubts. Father Lysander Vale, his fellow priest and closest confidant, appeared in the doorway. "It's time, Alaric." His eyes held a knowing concern that made Alaric wonder if his internal struggle was more visible than he'd thought. The procession began as it had thousands of times before. The smell of incense, the flicker of candles, the murmur of prayers. All the familiar elements that had once brought him comfort now felt like props in an elaborate charade. As he walked down the central aisle, the ancient floor stone seemed to shift beneath his feet. Bishop Cassius Thanatos Raven sat in his ornate chair near the altar, his stern presence a reminder of the unshakable authority Alaric was supposed to represent. The bishop's dark eyes followed him, and Alaric felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft whistling through the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. The Mass proceeded, and with each prayer, each gesture, each ritual response, Alaric felt himself drifting further from the certainty that had once anchored his life. The words that had once flowed like honey now stuck in his throat like thorns. Then came the moment of consecration. As he lifted the host, the most sacred point of the Mass, lightning split the sky outside. The stained glass windows blazed with momentary brilliance, casting kaleidoscope shadows across the altar. In that flash of illumination, Alaric saw the faces of his congregation, Sister Evangeline Frost with her hands clasped in fervent prayer, Monsignor Ambrose Pike's expression of serene confidence, the trusting eyes of countless faithful looking to him for guidance. And in that moment, standing before the altar with the sacred host raised high, the words of consecration turned to ashes in his mouth. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the collective intake of breath from the congregation. What happened next would change everything. not just for Father Alaric, but for every soul within the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers that night. The sacred host trembled in Father Alaric's elevated hands, his fingers betraying the earthquake of doubt that threatened to shatter his carefully constructed world. The silence in the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers stretched like an infinite abyss, broken only by the aggressive drumbeat of rain against ancient stained glass. "This is my body, which will be..." The words died in his throat, replaced by a different truth that clawed its way up from the depths of his soul. In that moment, before hundreds of faithful, Father Alaric Kai Merovec did the unthinkable. "How can this be your body?" His voice cracked like thunder. "When you remain silent in our suffering." The words echoed through the vaulted ceiling, bouncing off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of unwavering faith. The sacred host slipped from his trembling fingers, falling to the altar like a broken promise. Bishop Cassius Thanatos Raven rose from his ornate chair, his face a mask of contained fury. The congregation sat frozen, as if carved from the same stone as the saints that watched from their niches. Sister Evangeline Frost's rosary beads clattered to the floor, the sound sharp as breaking glass in the terrible silence. "Father Alaric!" Deacon Theron Blackthorn's voice cut through the shock, heavy with disapproval and fear. But Alaric was beyond hearing. 23 years of accumulated questions burst forth like a dam breaking under impossible pressure. Where were you when the children's ward burned? When the fishing boat sank? When Sister Vesper's cancer returned? Each question rang out louder than the last, each one a hammer blow against the foundations of faith. How many prayers must go unanswered before we acknowledge the silence? Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the cathedral through the rose window above the altar. The electric blue light caught the golden crucifix, casting twisted shadows that danced across the walls like accusations. Brother Sylvan, young and horrified, crossed himself repeatedly, his lips moving in silent prayer. Father Lysander Vale moved toward the altar, perhaps to intervene, but Bishop Cassius raised a hand to stop him. The bishop's dark eyes never left Alaric, watching with the intensity of a man witnessing either a tragedy or a miracle. It wasn't yet clear which. "The truth," Alaric continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "is that we gather here week after week, mouthing words that have lost their meaning, performing rituals that have become nothing more than muscle memory. We praise divine mercy while suffering continues. We speak of divine presence while feeling nothing but absence." The storm outside intensified, as if nature itself was responding to his crisis of faith. Wind howled through the cathedral's ancient stones, making the candles flicker wildly. Some extinguished entirely, plunging portions of the vast space into shadow. Sister Evangeline Frost stood suddenly, her white habit ghostly in the strange light. "Father Alaric." Her voice was gentle but carried clearly through the space. "Doubt is not the enemy of faith. It is..." "Enough!" Bishop Cassius's voice boomed through the cathedral. He strode toward the altar, his elaborate vestments sweeping behind him like storm clouds. "Father Alaric, you will step down from the altar immediately." But Alaric stood his ground, 23 years of certainty crumbling around him like the walls of Jericho. "No, Your Excellence. For once, we must speak the truth in this house of God. If he exists, let him answer now." At that moment, a deafening crack of thunder shook the cathedral to its foundations. The rose window above the altar vibrated with such intensity that several pieces of ancient glass broke free, falling like colored tears to shatter on the stone floor below. Several parishioners screamed, and Monsignor Ambrose Pike began ushering people toward the exits. Father Lysander finally reached the altar, his face a mixture of concern and determination. "Alaric, my friend, this is not the way. Whatever you're experiencing..." "What I'm experiencing, Lysander, is clarity," Alaric interrupted, his voice raw with emotion. "For the first time in decades, I'm speaking truth instead of reciting script." The cathedral was now half empty, but those who remained seemed rooted to their spots, unable or unwilling to look away from the drama unfolding before them. Brother Sylvan had moved closer to the altar, his young face showing not judgment but a deep, troubling understanding. Bishop Cassius reached the altar steps, his authority radiating from him like heat from a furnace. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Father Alaric Kai Merovec, you will step down now or I will have you removed. This sacrilege ends immediately. Alaric looked at the bishop, really looked at him, and saw not the terror-inspiring figure of authority he'd always been, but simply a man, perhaps as full of doubts and questions as himself, but better at burying them. Sacrilege? Alaric laughed, the sound hollow and strange in the sacred space. Is it sacrilege to seek truth? To demand answers from a God who promises to listen? To question why faith feels more like fear? Another crack of lightning illuminated the cathedral, closer this time, and in its brilliant flash, something extraordinary began to happen at the altar. The golden crucifix, which had hung there for over 2 centuries, began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the storm outside. What happened next would shake the foundations of faith for everyone present, transforming a crisis of faith into something far more profound than anyone could have imagined. The golden crucifix's glow intensified, bathing the altar in light that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. It wasn't the harsh electric brilliance of lightning, but something softer, deeper, ancient as creation itself. Father Alaric Kai Merovec found himself unable to look away, his tirade of doubt frozen on his lips. Bishop Cassius Thanatos Raven stumbled backward down the altar steps, his usual stern composure shattered. "Impossible," he whispered, the word barely audible above the storm's fury. The remaining parishioners fell to their knees, one by one, like dominoes of devotion. The light began to move, flowing like liquid gold from the crucifix down the altar's ancient stone. It pooled around the fallen host, which rose slowly into the air, suspended in the mysterious radiance. The sacred bread began to pulse with the same otherworldly rhythm as the crucifix above. "Mother of God," Sister Evangeline Frost breathed, her face illuminated by the strange light. "Father Alaric, look." But Alaric had already seen something else. Within the light, shapes were forming. At first, they appeared as mere shadows, but then they solidified into clear images. The children's ward that had burned. But now he saw what he hadn't known before. In the midst of the flames, countless small acts of mercy had bloomed. Nurses risking their lives to save patients, strangers becoming heroes, love manifesting in the darkest moment. The vision shifted to the lost fishing boat. Through the golden light, Alaric witnessed the final moments of those 12 souls. Not abandoned in their terror, but united in prayer, finding peace even as the waves claimed them. Their faith hadn't saved their bodies, but it had illuminated their final moments with a grace he had never understood until now. Tears streamed down Alaric's face as the light showed him Sister Vesper in her hospital room, her pain-racked body seemingly broken by cancer. But superimposed over this image was another, her spirit, radiant and whole, touching the lives of every person who visited her. Her suffering had become a crucible of compassion, transforming everyone who witnessed her unwavering faith. "I don't understand," Alaric whispered, his voice breaking. The doubt that had seemed so logical, so righteous moments before, began to crack like ice in spring. Father Lysander Vale stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the mysterious display. "Perhaps, Alaric, that's exactly the point. Understanding isn't what we're called to do." The strange light continued to pulse, and now it began to take on new forms. The air itself seemed to thicken with presence, and the familiar scent of incense was replaced by something else, a fragrance no one present had ever encountered before, yet each person would later describe it as the scent of home. Brother Sylvan, who had drawn closer to the altar, suddenly gasped, "The words! Look at the words!" Ancient text began to appear in the air, written in light, in every language known to those present. Each person saw the message in their native tongue, yet somehow knew that others were seeing it too. The words spoke not of blind faith or unquestioning obedience, but of something far more profound. "Faith is not the absence of doubt," Alaric read aloud, his voice steadying. but the courage to love in its presence. The message continued to unfold. Your questions are not betrayal. They are the path I have set before you. In your doubt, you draw closer to truth than those who never dare to question. Deacon Theron Blackthorne, who had been so quick to condemn Alaric's outburst, fell to his knees. All these years, he murmured, we thought certainty was the goal. The wind outside had died down, though rain continued to fall, its rhythm now gentle, almost musical. The cathedral's interior had become a space between spaces, where the veil between divine and human had grown gossamer thin. Bishop Cassius, still visibly shaken, found his voice at last. In all my years, never have I. He couldn't complete the thought, but his face had lost its mask of stern authority, replaced by an expression of wonder that made him look years younger. The light began to coalesce again, forming a new vision above the altar. This time, it showed scenes from throughout history. Countless others who had wrestled with doubt, questioned their faith, demanded answers. Religious figures from every tradition, some famous, others unknown, all united in their holy struggle with uncertainty. You are not alone, Alaric Kai Merovec, the words of light spelled out. Your doubt is as sacred as your devotion. Sister Evangeline Frost approached the altar, her habit glowing in the divine light. Don't you see, Father Alaric? Your questions didn't drive God away. They opened a door for this miracle. The suspended host began to descend slowly back to the altar, but now it seemed to carry within it a fragment of the mysterious light. As it touched the altar stone, a wave of warmth swept through the cathedral, reaching into every corner, touching every heart. Father Lysander placed a hand on Alaric's shoulder. Perhaps this is what real faith looks like, not a fortress against doubt, but a bridge across it. The light began to fade gradually, but something of its essence remained, caught in the facets of the stained glass, shimming in the air like dust motes in sunlight. The crucifix returned to its normal appearance, yet somehow it would never look quite the same to any who witnessed this night. As the supernatural display subsided, Father Alaric realized that his doubt hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. What had felt like a betrayal of his vocation now felt like an essential part of it. His questions hadn't destroyed his faith. They had deepened it. But this was only the beginning. What would follow in the days to come would transform not just Father Alaric's understanding of faith, but the entire community of the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers. The miracle at the altar had set in motion changes that none could have predicted, and its true meaning was yet to be fully understood. As the last traces of the miraculous light faded from the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers, an extraordinary silence descended. Not the tense, accusatory quiet of earlier, but something profound and expectant. The storm outside had calmed to a gentle rain, its drops creating a subtle melody against the ancient stained glass windows. Father Alaric Kai Merovec remained at the altar, his earlier rage and doubt transformed into something he couldn't yet name. The sacred host, still bearing a faint luminescence, lay before him like a question answered, and a mystery deepened simultaneously. His hands, which had trembled with uncertainty before, now rested steady on the altar stone. Bishop Cassius Thanatos Raven was the first to break the sacred silence. In all my years of service, he began, his voice carrying none of its usual authoritative steel, we have never. He paused, seemingly at a loss for words, perhaps for the first time in his distinguished career. The remaining parishioners began to stir, as if awakening from a shared dream. Some wept openly. Others embraced those nearest them, while a few remained kneeling, lost in private prayer. Brother Sylvan moved quietly through the congregation, offering comfort and collecting accounts of what each person had witnessed. Father Alaric, Sister Evangeline Frost approached the altar, her aged face radiant with understanding. What we've witnessed here, it's not just for you. It's for all of us, who have ever dared to question, who have ever felt that sharp edge of doubt cutting into our faith. Monsignor Ambrose Pike, who had returned after ensuring the safety of those who had fled earlier, stood at the entrance to the sacristy, his expression a mixture of awe and scholarly interest. "We must document this," he declared, pulling out a worn leather notebook. "Every detail, every word of light, every vision." Father Lysander Vale touched the spot on the altar where the host had hovered. "It's still warm," he whispered, drawing his hand back in wonder. "Like a living heartbeat." The cathedral's great doors opened, admitting Father Cyril Wolfram, the elderly priest who had been too ill to attend the evening's mass. He walked slowly up the center aisle, leaning heavily on his cane. "I saw the light from my window," he said, his voice quavering with age and emotion. "It called to me. I had to come." Deacon Theron Blackthorne, who had been among the first to condemn Alaric's outbreak of doubt, now approached him with tears in his eyes. "Forgive me, Father Alaric. I thought faith meant never questioning, never doubting. I see now how wrong I was." Father Alaric finally found his voice, though it emerged different than before, deeper somehow, and more certain even in its uncertainty. "There is nothing to forgive, Theron. We have all been students of the wrong lesson. We thought faith was about having answers, when it's really about living the questions." The rain outside began to ease, and through breaks in the clouds, the first stars of evening became visible through the cathedral's windows. Their light seemed to carry echoes of the miraculous display they had witnessed, as if the entire universe was affirming the truth revealed this night. Bishop Cassius cleared his throat, drawing all eyes to him. The usual stern lines of his face had softened, making him appear more human than ever before. "Father Alaric, what happened here tonight? It cannot be ignored or dismissed. The diocese will need to investigate, of course, but first..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "First, I believe we should complete the Mass. Together." A murmur of agreement swept through the gathered faithful. Those who had fled earlier were beginning to return, drawn by word of mouth and an inexplicable sensing that something profound had occurred in their absence. Sister Evangeline began organizing the choir, and soon the ancient hymns filled the cathedral once more, but they sounded different now, charged with new meaning. The Latin words that had seemed remote and formal now carried an immediacy that touched every heart. As Father Alaric prepared to continue the Mass, he noticed something extraordinary. The broken pieces of the rose window, which had fallen during his crisis of faith, lay on the altar steps arranged in a perfect pattern. Not random shards, but a new configuration that caught and reflected light in ways the original never had. "Look," Brother Sylvan pointed, his young face alight with understanding. "Even broken things can create new beauty." Father Lysander nodded, adding softly, "Perhaps that's what faith really is. Not the absence of breaks and doubts, but the light that shines through them." The congregation reassembled, but not in their usual rigid patterns. They drew closer together, forming a more intimate circle around the altar. The usual barriers of social status and religious hierarchy seemed to have dissolved in the aftermath of the miracle. As Father Alaric raised the still glowing host once more, he felt not the crushing weight of ritual, but the buoyant lift of authentic worship. The words of consecration returned to him, not as rote phrases, but as living truth. "This is my body, broken for you," he spoke, his voice clear and strong. "This is my blood, poured out for you." The ancient words carried new meaning, a testament not just to divine sacrifice, but to the holy nature of human vulnerability and questioning. But even as the service drew to its close, all present knew that this was just the beginning. The miracle at the altar had set in motion changes that would ripple out far beyond the walls of the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers. The transformation of doubt into a deeper faith was only the first step on a journey that would challenge and change them all. Dawn broke over Mistfall Grove the next morning, painting the coastal town in hues of pearl and gold. The Cathedral of Sacred Whispers stood transformed in the early light, not in its physical structure, but in the way it seemed to pulse with a new energy, like a heart awakened after long slumber. Father Alaric Kai Merovec had not slept. How could he, after what had transpired? He sat in the cathedral's library, surrounded by ancient texts and the morning's first light. Before him lay dozens of hastily written accounts from witnesses of the previous night's miracle. Each testimony added a new layer to the extraordinary tapestry of events. "You haven't rested," Father Lysander Vale's voice came from the doorway. He carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, the rich aroma cutting through the library's musty air. "How can I sleep?" Alaric accepted the coffee gratefully. "Everything has changed, Lysander. Everything. And nothing." "The phone hasn't stopped ringing since dawn." Lysander settled into a worn leather chair. "Word is spreading. People are calling it the Night of Living Light. Some are already calling it a miracle, others—" He paused, sipping his coffee. "Others are calling it a mass hallucination." The library door creaked open again, admitting Sister Evangeline Frost and Brother Sylvan. They carried more papers, more accounts, more questions, more attempts to capture the ineffable in words. "The morning mass was unlike anything I've ever seen," Sister Evangeline reported, her eyes bright with emotion. "The church was full to bursting. People who haven't attended in years came, drawn by the stories. And the most extraordinary thing," she smiled, "they're not just talking about the miracle, they're talking about doubt." Brother Sylvan nodded eagerly. "It's as if you gave them permission, Father Alaric. Permission to question, to wonder, to admit their struggles with faith. The conversations in the courtyard after Mass, I've never heard anything like it." A knock at the door interrupted them. Bishop Cassius entered, looking unusually disheveled, as if he too had passed a sleepless night. "The Vatican has been informed," he announced without preamble. "They're sending an investigator. Father Alaric, they'll want to speak with you first." "Let them come," Alaric replied calmly, surprising himself with his lack of anxiety. Truth is truth, whether it wears Vatican approval or not. The bishop's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "You sound different today, Alaric. More." "Peaceful?" Alaric suggested. "Not because I have fewer questions, Your Excellence, but because I finally understand that the questions themselves are sacred." Father Cyril Wolfram hobbled in, carrying a leather-bound volume so ancient its pages crackled like autumn leaves. "I found it," he announced triumphantly. "In the old archives. An account from 1742. Another priest, another crisis of faith, another divine intervention. Different in its details, but the pattern." His gnarled finger traced the yellowed page. "The pattern is the same." They gathered around as Father Cyril read from the ancient text. The account spoke of a priest in crisis, of divine light, of a congregation transformed not by certainty, but by the holy marriage of doubt and faith. "It's been happening throughout history," Monsignor Ambrose Pike added, entering with his own stack of research. "We just haven't been paying attention. Or perhaps we've been too afraid to speak of it." The morning light strengthened, streaming through the library's high windows in sheets of gold. Outside, they could hear the growing murmur of voices as more people gathered in the cathedral grounds, drawn by the spreading news of the previous night's events. "There's something else," Sister Evangeline said softly. "The broken pieces of the rose window? They've been reformed overnight." "Impossible," Bishop Cassius breathed. "See for yourself," she challenged gently. They made their way to the main cathedral space. There, above the altar where everything had changed, the rose window gleamed intact. But it was different. The pieces had reformed into a new pattern, one that told a different story. Instead of the traditional scenes of saints in glory, it now showed figures wrestling with angels, much like Jacob in the Old Testament. "It's us," Brother Sylvan whispered in awe. "All of us who have ever struggled with faith." Deacon Theron Blackthorne burst in, his usual composure shattered. "You need to see this," he insisted. "The people. They're sharing their own stories. Not just about last night, but about their own moments of doubt, their own wrestling with faith. It's like a floodgate has opened." Indeed, the cathedral courtyard had become a spontaneous gathering place. People stood in small groups, sharing experiences they had kept hidden for years. Stories of doubt, of questioning, of wrestling with faith, but also stories of light breaking through darkness, of faith deepened by the very questions that threatened to destroy it. Father Alaric watched from the cathedral steps, feeling the warm morning sun on his face. The miracle of the previous night hadn't eliminated his questions. Instead, it had sanctified them. He understood now that his role as a priest wasn't to provide all the answers, but to help people live meaningfully with the questions. "We're going to need guidance," Bishop Cassius said quietly, joining him on the steps. "This could easily spin out of control." "Perhaps," Alaric replied. "That's exactly what we need, to lose control, to admit that faith isn't something we can contain in dogma and ritual alone." The bishop considered this, watching as more people arrived, drawn by the growing energy of renewal. "The Vatican won't like that perspective." "The Vatican," Father Lysander interjected, "sent investigators to Lourdes too, to Fatima, to every place where divine mystery broke through human certainty. Perhaps that's the pattern. God speaks most clearly when we admit we don't have all the answers." The Vatican's investigator arrived 3 days later, on a morning when the fog clung to Mistfall Grove like a protective shroud. Monsignor Raphael Constantine stepped out of a sleek black car, his Roman collar stark against his dark suit. His reputation preceded him. Known throughout the church as the Doubter's Inquisitor, he had debunked more claimed miracles than any other investigator in recent history. Father Alaric watched from the cathedral's bell tower as the distinguished visitor made his way up the worn stone steps. The past 3 days had been extraordinary. Hundreds of pilgrims had already found their way to the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers, drawn by stories of the miraculous light and its message about the sanctity of doubt. "He doesn't look like I expected," Brother Sylvan observed, joining Alaric in his vigil. "I thought he'd be older, more severe." Indeed, Monsignor Constantine was surprisingly young, perhaps 40, with kind eyes that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. As he reached the cathedral doors, Bishop Cassius emerged to greet him, their voices carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "Welcome to Mistfall Grove, Monsignor Constantine," Bishop Cassius bowed slightly. "We've been expecting you." "Thank you, Your Excellence." Constantine's voice was gentle, almost musical. "I trust you understand the delicacy of this situation. Claims of divine manifestation must be thoroughly examined, especially in these skeptical times." Father Lysander appeared at the base of the bell tower stairs. "Father Alaric," he called softly, "they're ready for you in the bishop's study." The bishop's study had been transformed into a makeshift investigation headquarters. Recording equipment stood ready to document testimonies, and a team of scribes sat prepared to note every word. Monsignor Constantine sat in a leather armchair, a tablet computer incongruous against the room's medieval atmosphere. "Father Alaric Kai Merovec," Constantine began, his fingers poised over the tablet's screen. "Please tell me everything. Leave nothing out, no matter how insignificant it might seem." And so Alaric began his account, starting with the long months of growing doubt, the questions that had plagued his ministry, the suffering he had witnessed that seemed to mock the very concept of divine love. As he spoke of the moment of crisis at the altar, Constantine's fingers flew across the screen, his eyes never leaving Alaric's face. "And the light," Constantine prompted. "Describe it again." "It wasn't light as we know it." Alaric struggled to find the words. "It was more like truth made visible, like love given form." Sister Evangeline Frost was called in next, then Father Lysander, then dozens of others who had witnessed the event. Each account added new details while confirming the core experience. Constantine listened to them all, his expression remaining neutral, though something in his eyes seemed to soften as the hours passed. "Tell me about the window," he requested after the last witness had spoken. The reformed rose window had become something of a symbol, its new pattern of wrestling figures drawing as much attention as the accounts of miraculous light. "Perhaps you should see for yourself," Bishop Cassius suggested. The afternoon sun was hitting the window perfectly as they entered the cathedral's main space. The new design cast colored shadows across the floor, images of struggle, questioning, and ultimate transcendence. Constantine stood motionless, studying the window for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. In all my years of investigating claimed miracles, I have never seen anything quite like this. You mean you believe it's genuine? Brother Sylvan asked eagerly. What I believe, Constantine turned to face them, is not as important as what happened here. The facts are clear. Something extraordinary occurred in this cathedral. Something that transformed not just physical matter, he gestured to the window, but human hearts. Father Cyril Wolfram hobbled forward, clutching more ancient texts. We've found more accounts, he announced excitedly. Throughout history, across different faiths even, moments when divine mystery broke through human certainty, when doubt became a doorway to deeper truth. Constantine accepted the documents with evident interest. The Church has always known that faith is not the opposite of doubt, he said thoughtfully. The greatest saints often wrestled the hardest with uncertainty. Perhaps what happened here is a reminder of that forgotten truth. As if in response to his words, a shaft of sunlight broke through the fog outside, illuminating the altar through the rose window. The colored light fell exactly where the host had hovered during the miracle, creating a perfect circle of rainbow radiance. That happens every afternoon now, Sister Evangeline explained softly. At exactly the time when Father Alaric's doubt broke open to reveal something greater. Constantine approached the altar, touching the illuminated stone with reverent fingers. You know, he said, almost conversationally, I was sent here to investigate a miracle, but perhaps the real miracle isn't what happened that night. Perhaps it's what's happening now. People finding the courage to embrace their doubts as part of their faith journey. The afternoon light continued to paint the cathedral in shifting colors as Constantine shared something unexpected. Before I became an investigator, I too wrestled with doubt. I thought it made me unworthy of my calling. Now I wonder if it prepared me for it. Bishop Cassius, who had remained silent throughout much of the investigation, finally spoke. What will you tell Rome? Constantine smiled, a genuine warmth replacing his professional demeanor. I will tell them the truth, that something profound and genuine happened here. That divine mystery manifested not despite human doubt, but through it. That perhaps it's time for the Church to speak more openly about the sacred nature of questioning. And the pilgrims? Father Alaric asked. They keep coming. Let them come, Constantine replied. Let them bring their doubts, their questions, their wrestling. This place has become something rare and precious, a sanctuary not just for faith, but for the holy journey of questioning that leads to deeper faith. Word of Monsignor Constantine's preliminary findings spread through Mistfall Grove like wildfire. The Vatican investigators' unexpected openness to the miracle had given the events at the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers a new level of legitimacy. But more than that, his personal admission of wrestling with doubt had opened floodgates that no one could have anticipated. 1 week after the Night of Living Light, the cathedral grounds had become something entirely new. Pilgrims didn't just come to hear about the miracle. They came to share their own stories of doubt, questioning, and unexpected grace. Small groups gathered in the gardens, the courtyard, the ancient cloisters, each person finding voice for long-silenced struggles. Father Alaric Kai Merovec stood at his favorite spot in the bell tower, watching the sunrise paint the gathering crowds in gentle gold. The morning fog, ever present in Mistfall Grove, seemed to cradle the cathedral like a protective embrace. We've had to open the monastery guest quarters, Father Lysander reported, joining him at the window. And still, they keep coming. Not just Catholics, people of all faiths, and some with no faith at all. They're not really coming for the miracle anymore, Alaric observed. They're coming for something else. Permission. Sister Evangeline's voice came from the stairway as she climbed to join them. Permission to be honest about their struggles. Permission to question without being condemned. The cathedral bells began their morning toll, their deep resonance carrying across the town. Below, people looked up, their faces expectant. Something new was brewing in this ancient place of worship, something that transcended traditional boundaries of faith and doubt. Bishop Cassius had taken an unprecedented step the previous evening, after long discussions with Monsignor Constantine. The cathedral would become a center for what he called sacred questioning, a place where faith and doubt could coexist in honest dialogue. The morning session is about to begin. Brother Sylvan appeared, slightly out of breath from climbing the tower stairs. Father Alaric, they're asking for you. The cathedral's nave had been rearranged. The rigid rows of pews had been formed into circles, creating spaces for intimate discussion. The morning light streamed through the transformed rose window, its wrestling figures casting meaningful shadows across the gathered faces. "Welcome," Alaric began, his voice carrying naturally through the sacred space. "Welcome to your questions, your doubts, your struggles. Welcome to your faith, your hope, your journey." Today's gathering included faces that would have been shocking just a week ago. A rabbi seeking understanding of his own spiritual wrestling, a Muslim woman who had experienced a similar moment of divine light in her prayers, a self-proclaimed atheist drawn by the honesty of the discussions. Father Cyril Wolfram sat with his ancient texts open, drawing parallels between their experiences and those recorded through history. "The divine," he explained to an attentive group, "seems to delight in breaking through our certainties, perhaps because that's when we're finally ready to listen." Deacon Theron Blackthorne, who had once been the staunchest defender of unquestioning faith, now led a group focused on finding strength in vulnerability. "Our wounds," he was saying, "our doubts, they're not barriers to faith, they're doorways to deeper understanding." In one corner, Sister Evangeline had organized a special session for religious leaders struggling with their vocations. "We are not meant to be perfect," she reminded them. "We are meant to be authentic. Our congregations need our humanity as much as they need our guidance." Monsignor Constantine had extended his stay with Rome's blessing. He sat with a group of young seminarians, sharing his own journey through doubt to a more mature faith. His presence lent an official sanction to these unprecedented gatherings. "Something remarkable is happening here," he had told Bishop Cassius that morning. "This is not just about one miracle anymore. It's about the miracle that happens when people are finally free to be honest about their spiritual journey." The transformed rose window continued to tell its story in light and color. At certain times of day, the sunlight would catch it just so, and the figures seemed to move. Jacob wrestling with the angel, Moses questioning at the burning bush, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Ancient moments of sacred struggle made new in contemporary light. A young woman stood to share her story, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger. "I thought I was alone," she said. "I thought my questions meant I was losing my faith. Now I understand. My questions are leading me to a faith that's real, that's mine, that's lived, rather than just accepted." Father Alaric moved through the groups, listening, sharing, witnessing the transformation taking place. The miracle of the living light had been extraordinary. But this ongoing miracle of hearts opening, of honest seeking, of community forming around shared struggle, this was perhaps even more profound. "We're going to need more space," Bishop Cassius mused, watching as more people entered the cathedral. "And more support. This is growing beyond anything we could have imagined." "Perhaps that's exactly what's meant to happen," Father Lysander suggested. "Perhaps this is how faith grows too, by breaking out of old containers, finding new forms, touching lives in unexpected ways." As the morning sessions continued, a gentle rain began to fall outside, its rhythm a counterpoint to the murmur of honest conversation filling the cathedral. The scent of incense mingled with the fresh sea air flowing through opened windows, creating an atmosphere both ancient and new. Not everyone welcomed the changes at the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers. 2 weeks after the Night of Living Light, Father Alaric Kai Merovec faced his first real opposition. Cardinal Sebastian Blackwood, known throughout the church for his orthodox views, arrived unannounced on a storm-laden morning. "This must stop," were his first words, spoken even before greeting Bishop Cassius or acknowledging Monsignor Constantine's presence. "You've turned a house of God into a house of questioning. This is not what the church needs in these troubled times." The cardinal's presence seemed to fill the bishop's study, his crimson robes bright against the dark wood paneling. Outside, thunder rolled across Mistfall Grove, echoing the tension within. "Your Eminence," Monsignor Constantine began diplomatically, "if you would allow me to share my findings?" "I've read your preliminary report," Cardinal Blackwood cut him off. "A pretty story about divine light and transformed windows. But what's really happening here? People are being encouraged to doubt, to question, to challenge teachings that have stood for 2,000 years. Father Alaric, who had been silent until now, felt a familiar stirring in his soul. But this time, it wasn't doubt that moved him. It was clarity. "Your Eminence," he spoke quietly but firmly, "perhaps you should see for yourself before making judgments. Join us for today's gathering." The cardinal's refusal was immediate. "I have no interest in—" "Are you afraid of what you might find?" Sister Evangeline's voice came from the doorway. She stood there, aged but unbowed, her eyes bright with challenge. "Are you afraid that God might be bigger than our carefully constructed boundaries?" Bishop Cassius intervened before the cardinal could respond. "Sebastian," he used the cardinal's first name, reminding him of their old friendship, "just observe. One session, that's all we ask." Perhaps it was the use of his given name, or perhaps it was divine intervention, but Cardinal Blackwood's expression softened slightly. "One session," he conceded. "Then we discuss the future of this experiment." They led him into the cathedral proper, where the morning gathering was already underway. The transformed rose window cast its now familiar patterns of light across the circles of seekers. Father Lysander was leading today's session, his gentle voice carrying clearly through the sacred space. "Faith is not a fortress we hide in," he was saying, "but a journey we undertake. Each question is a step on that journey. Each doubt is an invitation to deeper truth." A young priest from a neighboring diocese stood to speak, his hands trembling slightly. "For years I've been afraid to admit my struggles with certain teachings. I thought it made me a bad priest. But here I've found that my questions don't separate me from God. They draw me closer." Cardinal Blackwood shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. A woman in her 60s stood next to, tears streaming down her face. "I left the church 20 years ago," she shared, "because there was no room for my questions. Now I feel like I've come home, not to certainty but to authentic seeking." The cardinal's hands tightened on his armrest as more people shared their stories. A theologian wrestling with ancient texts. A nun finding deeper meaning in her vows through honest questioning. A former atheist discovering faith precisely because doubt was honored here. Father Cyril Wolfram hobbled forward with his beloved ancient texts. "Your Eminence," he addressed the cardinal directly, "the Church has always had room for sacred questioning. The Desert Fathers, the great mystics, even doctors of the Church, they all wrestled with divine mystery." As if in response to the mounting tension, the weather outside intensified. Rain lashed against the windows, and lightning illuminated the cathedral in brilliant flashes. But inside, something extraordinary was happening. The transformed rose window began to glow with an inner light, not as dramatic as the original miracle, but unmistakable. The figures depicted in the glass, all those holy wrestlers with divine mystery, seemed to move in the strange light. Cardinal Blackwood stood abruptly, his face pale. "This is—" he began harshly, but his voice trailed off as the light from the window fell directly on him. In that moment, something shifted in the cardinal's stern countenance. Later, he would struggle to describe it, but witnesses would recall seeing tears in his eyes. "I remember," he whispered, though only those closest could hear. "I remember when I used to question, when I used to wonder." Brother Sylvan, ever attentive, brought him a chair. The cardinal sat heavily, still caught in the window's transformative light. "Your Eminence," Father Alaric approached carefully. "Perhaps the real miracle here isn't that people are questioning. Perhaps it's that they're finally being honest about the questions they've always had." The gathering continued around them, stories flowing like a river of shared humanity. Cardinal Blackwood sat silently, listening, watching, his initial opposition giving way to something more complex. "The Church has survived for 2 millennia," Bishop Cassius reminded him gently, "not by avoiding questions, but by engaging with them, by allowing divine mystery to speak in each generation." As evening approached, Cardinal Sebastian Blackwood remained in the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers long after the day's gathering had dispersed. He sat alone in a pew, his crimson robes catching the last rays of sunlight through the transformed rose window. The face that had arrived bearing judgment now showed signs of a profound inner struggle. Father Alaric watched from the shadows of the side chapel, remembering his own journey from crisis to transformation. Sister Evangeline approached the cardinal quietly, carrying a cup of tea and centuries of wisdom in her gentle presence. "Your Eminence," she spoke softly, offering the steaming cup. "Sometimes the hardest walls to break are the ones we've built inside ourselves." The cardinal accepted the tea with trembling hands. "Sister, I've spent 40 years defending the Church's certainties. I thought that was my calling, to be a bulwark against doubt, against questioning." He paused, watching the steam rise in the evening light. "But today you remembered something," she prompted gently. "I remembered the young priest I once was," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The questions I used to ask before I learned to bury them under doctrine and authority." Bishop Cassius and Monsignor Constantine joined them, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. The evening bells began to toll, their bronze voices carrying across Mistfall Grove like a call to reflection. "Sebastian," Bishop Cassius addressed his old friend, "remember our seminary days? The nights we stayed up debating theology, questioning everything? When did we start seeing questions as threats rather than invitations?" The cardinal's response was interrupted by the arrival of Father Lysander, who carried a dusty volume from the cathedral archives. "Your Eminence, we found something you might find interesting. It's a journal from 1847, written by another cardinal who visited here during a time of great change in the Church." The journal entry, read aloud in Father Lysander's clear voice, spoke of similar struggles, of tension between tradition and transformation, between authority and authenticity. The 19th century cardinal had also arrived as an opponent and left as an ally of necessary change. "History repeats itself," Father Cyril observed from his usual corner, surrounded by his beloved ancient texts. "Or perhaps God keeps teaching us the same lessons until we finally learn them." Outside, the evening fog rolled in from the sea, wrapping the cathedral in its mysterious embrace. Inside, more people began arriving for the evening gathering, a new tradition that had spontaneously emerged in the wake of the miracle. "Look at them," Sister Evangeline gestured to the arriving seekers. "They're not running from faith, Your Eminence. They're running toward it, but toward a faith that's alive, that breathes, that grows." Cardinal Blackwood stood, moving toward the altar where Father Alaric's crisis had sparked the miraculous events 2 weeks earlier. The transformed rose window cast its evening light upon the sacred space, and in that illumination, the cardinal's face showed signs of his own transformation. "I was sent here to end this," he admitted to the small group gathered around him. "Rome is concerned about the implications, about maintaining order and doctrine. And now," Monsignor Constantine prompted, "now I wonder if we've been too afraid of disorder, too quick to mistake questioning for rebellion." The cardinal touched the altar stone, still faintly warm from the day's light. "Perhaps God is doing something new here, or perhaps he's reminding us of something very old that we've forgotten." Brother Sylvan appeared with a group of young seminarians who had traveled from Rome to witness the changes at Mistfall Grove. Their presence seemed to emphasize the significance of the moment, the old and new church meeting at a crossroads of transformation. "Your Eminence," one young seminarian spoke hesitantly, "we've been taught that doubt is the enemy of faith. But here we're seeing something different." The cardinal looked at these future priests, seeing in their eager faces the same questions he had once carried. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we need to teach differently, to lead differently." As if in response to his words, The last rays of sunlight caught the rose window in a particular way, sending ribbons of color dancing through the cathedral. The figures in the glass, all those holy wrestlers with divine mystery, seemed to nod in approval. "What will you tell Rome?" Bishop Cassius asked the question that hung in the air. Cardinal Blackwood straightened, his authority now tempered with newfound humility. "I will tell them that something authentic is happening here, that God is speaking through the very questions we've been taught to fear, that perhaps the Church needs this reminder that faith is not about having all the answers, but about staying faithful in the asking." Father Alaric stepped forward, finally breaking his watchful silence. "Your Eminence, when I questioned at that altar 2 weeks ago, I thought I was losing my faith. Instead, I was finding a deeper one. Perhaps that's what's happening here on a larger scale." The evening gathering began to take shape around them, people forming their now familiar circles of shared seeking. The cardinal watched as young and old, religious and secular, certain and questioning, came together in sacred conversation. "The Church has always grown through challenge," Monsignor Constantine observed, "through engagement with difficult questions, through the courage to face doubt honestly." The morning after Cardinal Sebastian Blackwood's transformation dawned clear and bright, a rarity in Mistfall Grove. The fog that typically shrouded the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers had lifted, as if nature itself was acknowledging the clarity that had emerged from the previous day's events. News of the cardinal's change of heart spread rapidly through religious circles. By sunrise, the cathedral's phone lines were buzzing with calls from media outlets, church officials, and curious clergy from around the world. Father Alaric Kai Merovec stood at his usual spot in the bell tower, watching as television vans began arriving in the parking lot. "It's starting," Father Lysander observed, joining him at the window. "The story's getting bigger than Mistfall Grove." "Are we ready for that?" Brother Sylvan asked, his young face showing both excitement and concern. Before anyone could respond, Sister Evangeline arrived with unexpected news. "The cardinal is still here," she announced. "He's been in the chapel all night writing. He says he's had a revelation." They found Cardinal Blackwood in the small side chapel, surrounded by papers covered in his elegant handwriting. The morning light through the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across his worn face, but his eyes were bright with purpose. "Ah, good, you're all here." He looked up from his work. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, about what's been happening here since the miracle. This isn't just about one cathedral or one community anymore. This is about the future of faith itself." Bishop Cassius arrived, followed by Monsignor Constantine. The cardinal stood, gathering his papers with trembling hands. "I've drafted a proposal," he announced, "a formal recommendation to Rome. The Cathedral of Sacred Whispers should become an official center for sacred dialogue, a place where faith and questioning can coexist openly, where doubt is recognized as part of the spiritual journey." The implications of such a proposal were enormous. Coming from a cardinal known for his orthodox views, it carried weight that couldn't be ignored. "Sebastian," Bishop Cassius breathed, "you understand what you're suggesting? This would be unprecedented." "So was the resurrection," the cardinal replied with unexpected humor. "The Church has always grown through bold steps, through moments when we dare to listen to how God is speaking in our time." Father Cyril hobbled in, clutching more of his historical documents. "Actually," he interjected, "there is precedent. In the early Church, in the desert communities, in the medieval monasteries, there were always places dedicated to wrestling with divine mystery." The morning light strengthened, sending rays through the transformed rose window in the main cathedral. The whole space seemed to glow with possibility. "There's more," Cardinal Blackwood continued. "I want to establish a new kind of training program. Future priests, nuns, religious leaders, they need to learn how to guide people through questioning, not just provide answers. What's happening here could become a model for spiritual formation." Monsignor Constantine nodded thoughtfully. "The Vatican Investigative Office has been discussing something similar. We see too many cases of people leaving faith altogether because there's no space for their questions." Outside, the media presence was growing. Crews set up cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cardinal who had arrived as an opponent and remained as an advocate. But inside the cathedral, something more significant was taking shape. "We'll need help," Father Alaric said, thinking practically. "If we're to become what you're suggesting, we'll need resources, support, a framework for managing what's already growing here." "You'll have it," the cardinal assured him. "My influence in Rome may have been for enforcing orthodoxy, but now it will serve a different purpose. Sometimes God works through irony." Sister Evangeline, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "The people who come here, they're not looking to abandon faith. They're looking to deepen it. They need guides who've walked through their own darkness." "Exactly," Cardinal Blackwood agreed. "And that's why your story, Father Alaric, needs to be told. Your crisis at the altar, the miracle that followed, it's a template for transformation." The morning's first pilgrims were beginning to arrive, their voices carrying through the cathedral's open doors. Among them were more priests, nuns, and religious leaders drawn by reports of what was happening in Mistfall Grove. "Look at this," Brother Sylvan called from the entrance. A group of young seminarians from various denominations had formed a circle in the courtyard, sharing their struggles and questions openly. "It's already spreading," Father Lysander observed. "The question is, how do we nurture it? How do we ensure it remains authentic and doesn't become just another program?" The cardinal's response was interrupted by a commotion at the cathedral doors. A prominent religious author and critic had arrived, known for his scathing commentary on church affairs. But rather than coming to condemn, he came seeking understanding. "I've been watching what's happening here," he told the gathered group. "This could be the beginning of a new chapter in religious history, a time when faith and doubt are no longer seen as opponents, but as dance partners in the spiritual journey." 1 month after the Night of Living Light, the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers hummed with unprecedented activity. Workers carefully installed scaffolding around the transformed rose window, not to change it, but to preserve it. Architects surveyed the medieval structure, planning expansions to accommodate the growing number of pilgrims and seekers. In the cathedral garden, construction had already begun on a new reception center. Father Alaric Kai Merovec watched the transformation from his favorite spot in the bell tower, remembering the crisis that had started it all. Sister Evangeline appeared at his side, offering a cup of coffee and her characteristic wisdom. "Thinking about how far we've come?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression. "Thinking about how far we have to go," he replied. "Sometimes I wonder if we're ready for what's coming." What was coming was bigger than any of them had initially imagined. Cardinal Blackwood's proposal had not only been accepted by Rome, but had been expanded. The Cathedral of Sacred Whispers would become the first of several centers for sacred dialogue worldwide. "The latest count is in," Father Lysander announced, climbing the tower stairs with a stack of papers. "We've received over 300 applications for the first training program, religious leaders from every denomination, and even some spiritual teachers from other traditions." Bishop Cassius had converted his entire residence into temporary offices to handle the administrative demands. The ancient building buzzed with activity as staff processed applications, coordinated with religious organizations, and developed curriculum for the new training programs. "We've received another interesting visitor," Brother Sylvan called from below. "A quantum physicist who's also a Buddhist monk. He says he's been studying the intersection of science and spiritual questioning for decades." The entrance of Dr. Marcus Chen, physicist monk, marked another evolution in the cathedral's journey. His presence represented a bridge between scientific inquiry and spiritual seeking, exactly the kind of dialogue the center hoped to foster. "Your miracle with the light," Dr. Chen observed, studying the rose window through both scientific and spiritual lenses. "It bears remarkable similarities to quantum phenomena. Reality itself seems to respond to authentic questioning." Cardinal Blackwood, who had extended his stay indefinitely, found himself increasingly fascinated by such cross-disciplinary conversations. "Perhaps," he mused, "this is what the Church has been missing, the courage to engage with all forms of human questioning." The afternoon sun broke through clouds, sending shafts of light through the rose window. The transformed glass caught the light differently now, creating patterns that seemed to dance with living energy. Father Cyril insisted these patterns corresponded to ancient sacred geometries he'd found in his historical research. "We're receiving more than just religious seekers," Sister Evangeline reported during the daily planning meeting. "Scientists, philosophers, artists, they're all drawn to what's happening here. It's becoming a confluence of questioning souls." Monsignor Constantine, who had become an unofficial ambassador for the center, smiled at this news. "That's exactly as it should be. Faith doesn't just dialogue with doubt, it dialogues with all human seeking." The evening gathering had evolved as well. The rigid circles had given way to more organic groupings. Tonight, a theologian sat with an astrophysicist, their conversation bridging heaven and earth. Nearby, a group of young priests engaged with a Jewish rabbi and a Muslim imam, exploring common grounds of questioning and faith. "Look at them," Father Alaric gestured to the gathered seekers. "A month ago, these conversations would have seemed impossible." Father Lysander nodded thoughtfully. "The miracle opened a door, but it's human courage that's keeping it open. Every person here has chosen to step through that door, to brave the uncertainty of authentic seeking." The cathedral itself seemed to have adapted to its new role. The ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of worship now witnessed a new kind of devotion, one that honored questions as much as answers. The transformed rose window had become a symbol of this new approach to faith, its wrestling figures reminding all who entered that struggle could be sacred. "We've received word from other dioceses," Bishop Cassius announced, joining the evening gathering. "They're requesting guidance on establishing their own dialogue centers. The movement is spreading." Cardinal Blackwood, who had once feared such change, now embraced it with grandfatherly joy. "Let it spread," he declared. "Let every church become a place where questions are honored, where doubt can lead to deeper faith." Dr. Chen, the physicist monk, added his own observation. "In quantum mechanics, we speak of entanglement, how particles once connected remain influenced by each other across any distance. Perhaps faith works the same way. Once we connect authentically with divine mystery, that connection remains, even in our questioning." As night fell over Mistfall Grove, the cathedral glowed with warm light from within. The evening fog rolled in from the sea, wrapping the ancient structure in its mystical embrace. But now the fog seemed less like a shroud and more like a reminder of how mystery and clarity could coexist. 3 months after the night of living light, Father Alaric Kai Merovec stood before a packed cathedral, his heart full of wonder at how far they'd come. The Cathedral of Sacred Whispers had been transformed, not just spiritually, but physically. The new wings harmoniously blended with the ancient structure, creating spaces for dialogue, contemplation, and communal seeking. "When I questioned God's existence at this very altar," he began his address to the gathered crowd, "I thought I was experiencing the end of faith. Instead, it was the beginning of something far more profound." The audience included religious leaders from around the world, gathered for the official inauguration of the Center for Sacred Dialogue. Cardinal Blackwood sat in the front row, his face bearing the peaceful expression of one who had found a new purpose in life. "Faith," Father Alaric continued, "isn't a fortress that keeps questions out. It's a garden where they can grow into understanding." Sister Evangeline, standing near the transformed rose window, nodded in agreement. The window had become famous in its own right, with artists and architects traveling from across the globe to study its unique properties. Even now, as the morning sun struck its surface, the figures seemed to move with living light. "Each of us," Alaric gestured to his fellow pioneers, Father Lysander, Brother Sylvan, Bishop Cassius, and the others who had been there from the beginning, "has been transformed by what happened here. But the real miracle isn't what occurred on that stormy night. The real miracle is what continues to happen every day in this sacred space." The cathedral had indeed become a place of daily miracles, not the spectacular kind with divine light, but the subtle miracles of hearts opening, minds expanding, and souls finding peace in the midst of questioning. The morning gatherings now regularly included scientists discussing the wonder of creation with priests, philosophers exploring ethical dilemmas with rabbis, and spiritual seekers of all backgrounds finding common ground in their quest for truth. "We've learned," Father Alaric continued, his voice carrying through the vaulted space, "that doubt doesn't diminish faith, it deepens it. Questions don't weaken belief, they strengthen it. And mystery. Mystery isn't something to fear, but something to embrace." Dr. Chen, the quantum physicist monk who had become a regular presence at the cathedral, smiled from his seat. His recent paper on the parallels between quantum uncertainty and spiritual questioning had sparked international interest in the center's work. The inauguration ceremony continued with Cardinal Blackwood officially blessing the new facilities. "Let this place," he intoned, "be forever dedicated to the sacred dance of faith and questioning, of certainty and doubt, of answers and mystery." As if in response to his words, the rose window caught the light in a particular way, sending ribbons of color dancing through the cathedral. The figures of holy wrestlers forever captured in glass seemed to bow in approval. Father Cyril, surrounded by his beloved ancient texts, had discovered something remarkable just that morning. "Throughout history," he had told them, "there have been places like this, sanctuaries where seeking was sacred. We're not creating something new, we're remembering something essential." The ceremony concluded with an unexpected announcement from Bishop Cassius. The Vatican had approved plans for similar centers to be established on every continent. The Cathedral of Sacred Whispers would serve as the model and training ground for this worldwide network of sacred dialogue. "But remember," Sister Evangeline cautioned during the closing prayers, "we're not just creating institutions. We're nurturing spaces where souls can be honest, where questions can breathe, where doubt can lead to deeper faith." As the gathered crowd moved to the new reception hall for the celebration, Father Alaric remained behind in the main cathedral space. He stood at the altar, where his crisis of faith had sparked such extraordinary changes. "Thank you," he whispered, touching the ancient stone. "Thank you for teaching us that sometimes the greatest act of faith is to question faithfully." The transformed rose window cast its ever-changing light across the altar, and in that moment, Father Alaric understood something profound. The miracle hadn't just been for him, or even for the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers. It had been a reminder to all people that divine mystery is large enough to hold all our questions, deep enough to contain all our doubts, and loving enough to transform our uncertainties into pathways of grace. Outside, the familiar fog of Mistfall Grove wrapped the cathedral in its gentle embrace, but now it seemed less like a shroud of uncertainty and more like a reminder that some truths are best approached through holy mystery. The legacy of that stormy night when a priest dared to question would continue to ripple outward, touching lives and transforming faith for generations to come. And in the Cathedral of Sacred Whispers, the light would continue to dance through the transformed rose window, telling its story of wrestling, questioning, and ultimate grace to all who dared to look up and wonder. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.